Got it.
All right. Colin, thank you for coming for this documentary
Thanks for having me.
on ODR. So, can you please tell us first off where we are?
Sure. Yes, we are currently in Nancy Welsh's office at Texas A&M School of Law in Fort Worth, Texas. Nancy is the director of the dispute resolution program here, and I'm a practitioner in residence. So it was very kind of her to loan me. I can't take credit for any of these erudite books behind me. That's all. Those are all Nancy's. But yes, it's appropriate to be having this conversation, Mac, right in the heart of Texas A&M Law School.
And you're not a lawyer.
I'm not. That's right. I'm an NLM, a non-lawyer mediator.
Yes. So tell us then about your background. How did you get to this position? First, going back way back in Dallas.
Sure. Well, I don't know how far back you want to go to my formative years. I did an essay on, why did you end up personal histories and conflict resolution? I really had to think about, well, how did I end up doing this? But when I was in high school, I did a lot of debate. And it was a lot of intellectual conflicts, gladiatorial conflict, flying around the country and debating against other nerdy, wordy high school seniors like myself. And I kind of got burned out on that. And I decided, well, what's the opposite of debate? Well, it's helping people figure out how to reach agreement, make peace. So I went to a school that didn't really have a debate program. And I got trained. It was a Quaker college outside of Philadelphia called Haverford. And I was trained by the American Friends Services Committee. They had something called the Friends Suburban Project, and they came out and they did a mediation training at Haverford. And I was like, this is it. This is what I want to do with the rest of my life. So I got a position co-managing the campus mediation program. I wrote my thesis, my undergrad thesis, on student-centered collegiate mediation programs. And then I got an internship at the National Institute for Dispute Resolution in Washington, D.C. So I was off to the races.
Yes. The first time I ever heard about you was probably 10 years ago. I got my certificate in 2017 for mediation, but the question of online mediation came up and your name came up immediately.
Oh, good.
As the go-to person. And so it's an honor, to be able to sit down with you.
Oh, please, my friend. The honor is all mine. I think if you do anything for 30 years, eventually you build a reputation. So,
Yes.
yeah, but so I actually worked in dispute resolution before there was an ODR, and ended up working at NIDR in DC and then doing the Peace Corps, and came back and I was getting my degree focusing on conflict resolution. And then the internet started to hit. People started to say, wow, the internet's going to change the world. And I was excited about that because I was a nerd. And the big question was, how are people that engage in transactions on the internet going to resolve the problems that arise?
Yes.
So I thought, wow, this is dispute resolution and technology. I should live there. That's where I should make my career. So
Exactly. Well, let's slow down on that segment.
Sure.
Really, really well. So 2000, can you take us back to what was going on in the world in 1999 to 2000?
Sure.
When it comes to e-commerce and the internet.
Absolutely. For those of you who are not there, because now it's been enough years that there might be some people watching this who were not around at that time period, the internet was exploding. There was the first web browser, Mosaic, really came out in the mid-90s. And there were lots of us who had been nerds. I ran a bulletin board, actually, off of my computer here in North Texas when I was 10, 11 years old. And that's where people would dial up to each other's computers over modems. But this notion of a global connected network really captured, they called it the information superhighway.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of talk about, well, what is this going to mean for information, for intellectual property, for commerce? And there was just a lot of excitement, a lot of enthusiasm. I would say that was the first bubble, that phase of the internet. So there were many, many companies that were created in that time period trying to figure out how can we use technology to do things more efficiently. And really commerce was the focus of it. So that was when eBay was first created. That was when Amazon was first created. And there are many, many other e-commerce websites that didn't make it, like pets.com. But the popular imagination, because we never had the ability to buy something online before, and kind of the infinite mall of everything you could imagine, eBay was not only selling new in-box merchandise, it was also selling, collectibles, one-off things that somebody just had, an old comic book or a program from a theater program from 30 years ago. And it was very exciting to be able to go to one marketplace and find these things that were so meaningful to people. So there was a lot of talk about what is this new borderless e-commerce look like? And the piece of it that interested me, obviously, was the dispute resolution piece, because we're going to have people all over the world. You can have a buyer in Argentina and a seller in Paris and a marketplace in the United States, and the item is being drop shipped out of China. The judicial system, which is how we resolved most of these disputes in the past, was very tied to geography. So, how are we going to build a system that can resolve these disputes that can arise between any two people on the planet, each of whom is subject to different legal jurisdictions? And that was really what got us excited about the prospect of building a global ODR system.
Yes. So we've often heard that dilemma that the more technology is introduced into a space, then the more conflict that then follows.
That's right.
Have you seen that to be true? And if so, how did that apply to the e-commerce?
Sure, sure. Well, Ethan Katch is the father of online dispute resolution. Before I ever got involved in ODR in the late 90s, he'd been thinking about law and technology for a decade or more at that point. And Ethan, I remember I attended a conference with him very early on. I think it was the ABA Dispute Resolution Section Conference in Washington, D.C. And he raised his hand. There was a presenter who was saying, the big thing at that time was called Electronic Document Interchange, EDI. And the presenter was saying, we're not going to have any more disputes because once we have this EDI set up, there's not going to be any ability for people to have miscommunications, which I thought was ridiculous because, you generate more transactions, you generate more disputes. And Ethan stood up. I didn't know him very well at that time, but he said, respectfully, sir, the power of technology to resolve disputes is dwarfed by the power of technology to generate new disputes. And I think that that's been borne out. I think to create this global information superhighway and enable people to engage in transactions all around the world and interact with people, in every culture, it has generated many, 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 many more disputes than it has resolved. And we certainly have built new technology tools, particularly in the e-commerce context, to make resolutions faster and more efficient and more transparent. But, the number of disputes continues to grow. And that's one of the good things about being in dispute resolution. We will never be out of work. There's always going to be more disputes.
Exactly. So can you, for the people who were not even born yet, back in the early 2000s, tell us, can you share some stories about PayPal and eBay?
Absolutely.
Because those were the genesis, right, of where online dispute resolution started taking hold.
Right.
Give us a bit more of that.
Well, let me tell you that I'll start back at the beginning, actually. I think the beginning of online dispute resolution as a field happened at a conference in 1997 that was convened in Washington, D.C. It was called the NC-AIR Conference. The National Conference on Artificial Intelligence Research, I think, was the sponsoring organization. And Ethan Katch attended that conference and a couple other ODR pioneers, including Hank Parrott, who was a dean at a law school in Illinois. And there was some discussion about how are we going to resolve all the disputes that are going to arise in this new global online e-commerce marketplace. And that was sort of the beginning. The first time anyone referred to online dispute resolution was at that meeting. And the next year, Ethan started a program at UMass Amherst called CITDR, the Center for Information Technology and Dispute Resolution. And he started an online conference called ADR Cyber Week. And he invited people who were interested in dispute resolution online to come to this conference. And it was a pretty small conference at the beginning. But, we were all excited about the potential of the growth of the internet and trying to figure out how we could build redress systems that would work in this new environment. And we had a discussion forum, I remember, in 1998. What should we call this field? People called it electronic dispute resolution, EADR, or technology-assisted dispute resolution. But we eventually settled on ODR because we wanted to emphasize the connection between ADR and ODR. ODR shares the same objectives as ADR, helping people find fair, efficient resolutions to their problems. And a lot of the ethical guardrails that guide face-to-face dispute resolution practice, we adopted as well in online dispute resolution. But we were just kind of wrapping our heads around, well, you can do mediation online, but how does doing it online change mediation? What are some of the things you can do face-to-face that you can't do online, and vice versa? Because technology gave us new capabilities in resolving. And my first article at mediate.com, I'm very proud, back in 2000, was called New Mediator Capabilities in Online Dispute Resolution. So we were all very excited about the potential for all of this. Ethan actually started a pilot program with an auction website, kind of like eBay. It was a smaller version of eBay, but it was started by some law students. I think they were based in Ohio. And they found Ethan because he was a very prominent scholar in this area. And they said, hey, will you resolve the disputes between our buyers and sellers within our auction marketplace? So Ethan said, sure, that sounds interesting. Let's set a program to do that. So he hired a guy named Mark in Amherst near the legal studies program at UMass. And they started to resolve some of these disputes between buyers and sellers. Well, it turns out that smaller auction marketplace was eventually bought by eBay, who was really the big kahuna at the time. And the thing about auctions is they have what's called the network effect, which means eventually everything consolidates into one marketplace. Because for the most choice, consumers want to go to the marketplace with the largest number of items for sale. So there were a couple of marketplaces, but eBay was one of the big ones, and it was gobbling up smaller ones. So those 3 law students that had started that smaller auction marketplace, when they went to eBay, they said, hey, we started this pilot with Ethan Katch, this professor at UMass Amherst. You should take this on, eBay. You should do this because this is really valuable. So they did. And in partnership with the Center for Information Technology and Dispute Resolution, they put a link on the eBay homepage. This is probably around 1998, 1999, and said, hey, if you have a dispute, click here and we'll help you out. And those cases all went to CITDR and to Mark, and they were just swamped with hundreds and hundreds of cases of buyers and sellers with problems that they needed to resolve. And it was very clear from an eBay's perspective and from CITDR's perspective that there was a business here. We needed to, figure out how to do this well. And Ethan, very soon after, was contacted by a team of people that had just graduated from Harvard Business School. They started a company called TransSecure, and they were thinking about, well, maybe we could provide online dispute resolution services for e-commerce transactions to help secure people's transactions. Eventually, they changed the name. It wasn't TransSecure. They made it into SquareTrade. So eBay worked with the SquareTrade founders, Ahmed, Steve, and Lavita, to build the first e-commerce resolution program at scale. And eBay really embraced it. And SquareTrade became a phenomenon on eBay. And eventually they were successful enough to get their SquareTrade seal on something like 16% of the items for sale at eBay, because there was such a need for security in transactions and fast and fair resolution should something go wrong. So sellers realized that they had a benefit in the marketplace when they put a little seal on their item that said, hey, you can buy with security from me because if anything goes wrong, we can use SquareTrade to resolve the problem. So that was really the genus of the ODR program at eBay.
Got it. And so all during this time, I understand that your policy was not to handle any kind of, I guess, emotional type of cases like family cases, right?
Right.
It was strictly business. So can you tell us what was the pivot, or how do we now get to the point where people are using ODR to handle every kind of case?
Well, it's a great question. I was working at Mediate.com. I was general manager of Mediate.com. Mediate.com was not an ODR company. It was really an online directory of mediators, sort of promoting best practices. This would have been 1998, again, 1999. And then I said, look, this online dispute resolution thing is taking off. I think we need to do a dedicated company focused on resolving online disputes. So with the assistance of the 2 founders of Mediate.com, we spun out a company from Mediate.com called OnlineResolution.com. And it was one of the first ODR providers. We were a competitor to SquareTrade. And there were a couple other providers at that time. There was CyberSettle.com, which was doing blind bidding things. There was the Claim Room. There was eResolution in Canada, which is one of the pioneering ODR providers, which started by Karim Benyaklev. So there were companies that were being created to tackle this problem and figure out how to solve it. I actually approached Ethan at the same time that the SquareTrade team approached Ethan and said, hey, maybe you want to work with OnlineResolution.com. But I understand why he decided to go with SquareTrade, because they were well capitalized and very, very connected. But I started to build out my company as well, doing online dispute resolution. We were based in Cambridge, Mass. And we actually were contacted by PayPal, which ironically at the time was a payment provider to eBay, but they had a very contentious relationship. eBay was trying to build its own payment provider called BillPoint, but PayPal was succeeding wildly because they were providing huge incentives to eBay sellers to adopt PayPal. So eBay and PayPal were kind of locked in a struggle at that moment. And because eBay was associated with SquareTrade, PayPal reached out to me. And I went out and was able to meet the founders of PayPal. That was Peter Thiel and Elon Musk and David Sachs and a lot of people that have become very, very successful since then. But they knew, even as a payment provider, they needed to have a way to resolve any disputes that arose between buyers and sellers. So I didn't end up working with PayPal. Actually, once I found out about how high their fraud rates were, I said, I don't think I want to get involved with these guys. But then eBay bought PayPal for more than $1 billion so that they could control the payment mechanism, because a lot of the resolutions to disputes arise on the payment side. saying, oh, the buyer's not happy. Okay, we're going to take the money from the seller and give it back to the buyer. So the e-commerce marketplace really does need to control payments in order to manage the whole dispute resolution ecosystem. And essentially, SquareTrade said to eBay, look, you need to buy us. We're so important to you. You need to buy us. We're on 16% of your listings. And it wasn't Steve and Ahmed and Lalitha that asked for this price. It was their investors. But the investors asked for $120 million to buy the company. And eBay said, we're not going to pay that. That's too much. So they went looking for other companies that they could work with or other experts. And I had written a book called Online Dispute Resolution for Business. They found that book and they called me up and asked me to come out and consult at eBay. And then they offered me a job. And I said, well, I can't come out. I'm running a company in Massachusetts. I'm busy. And they said, well, here's how much we want to pay you. So, okay, I guess I work for eBay now. So I moved out in 2003 to San Jose, and I became the first director of online dispute resolution at eBay and PayPal. And the senior vice president that hired me said, okay, great, you can go fire SquareTrade. And I said, no, I think we still want to work with SquareTrade. They provided an important service in the marketplace that we couldn't do as an internal systems designer. But we did end up building an online dispute resolution platform within eBay and eventually within PayPal as well that we called the Resolution Center. And I was there from 2003 to 2011. And by the time I left, we were doing about 60 million disputes per year. And 90% of those resolutions were software only. So we didn't have a human mediator or customer service rep that needed to touch the case. It was just the parties to the dispute, usually buyers and sellers. So we learned a lot. And eBay spent tens of millions of dollars building out this resolutions infrastructure because they knew that consumers had to have assurance that should a problem arise, they could get a fast and fair resolution. So a lot of the benefit from building the Resolution Center and providing those consistent resolutions went to users that never had a dispute. They just knew that if a dispute did arise, there was a system that was put together that was trustworthy and transparent that could get them a fair outcome. And then eventually I built that at eBay and then moved over to PayPal and built the Resolution Center at PayPal as well. Because people were using PayPal to pay for many other things, not just on eBay. They were buying digital items, services, things like that. So we needed a resolution center there as well. So it was a very exciting time. We were answering some of these questions about how online dispute resolution could work at scale all around the world for cross-border marketplaces. Nobody had really thought about how to do that before. And, I sort of thought of eBay as like an online country. If you counted up all of our citizens, all of our users as citizens, we would have been the 8th largest country in the world, which sounded pretty big. But, that was before we had massive companies like Facebook and Google, that dwarfed eBay. But, we needed a justice system. We needed to be able to ensure that people got fair treatment. And that was sort of my job within the trust and safety division to think through how do we provide fast and fair resolutions to our customers, to the buyers and the sellers, to make them want to continue to use eBay and trust that they were going to get a fair deal there. So, we learned a lot. It was very exciting.
So would you say that model that eBay started implementing has now been carried over into all sorts of payment dispute systems? I recently received an email from Stripe, for example.
Sure.
My payment processing services, and they were introducing me to a new dispute resolution system that they have.
Yep.
In order to address clients' complaints really quickly. I think payments from people and they may have concerns. So do they go back and model themselves off what you had done?
Yeah, I think to a certain extent. When I first got to eBay, they didn't really have a dispute resolution person there. So if a buyer bought something on eBay and they had a problem, maybe they bought it and it didn't show up, or they bought it and it arrived and it wasn't what they expected, the name of that platform, the name of that system at eBay was called the fraud alert process. Now, the challenge of calling it fraud alert is you're teaching your users that they are being defrauded. Now, if you actually looked at those transactions, the vast majority of those problems were misunderstandings. But if you call it fraud, it sort of implies a level of intentionality, which changes the way people think about the marketplace. Another big problem on eBay was payment disputes. So eBay was an auction house. So someone could list an item and then different people would bid on it. And then eventually someone would win. The time would run out and they'd be the winning bidder. Well, a lot of the time, the bidders would not follow through and pay. And that problem, when I arrived at eBay, was called the deadbeat bidder problem. And sellers were very angry because if you list a Ferrari and a 12-year-old bids $1 billion on it and they win, well, you have to go through the whole process of listing it again. And there were fees that you had to pay to eBay. So it was a very annoying problem. But again, getting the yes, one of the key tenets of dispute resolution says, look, focus on the problem, not on the person. And if you call it a deadbeat bidder, you are essentially saying the name of the process says who is at fault. But there were many circumstances where it was appropriate for a bidder not to pay. Say if the seller changed the terms and said, well, I said shipping was going to be $5, but now it's $20. Well, it's a legitimate thing for a buyer not to pay there. That doesn't make them a deadbeat. So when I gave that advice to eBay, they softened it a little bit. They changed it from deadbeat bidder to the non-paying bidder, but I still didn't like it because you're still, naming the process around who's at fault. So when I got there and got control, we renamed it the unpaid item process, UPIs. And, the whole marketplace, we have millions and millions of users. They were like, oh boy, the PC police are here, political correctness. You're trying to soften the language. But I noticed that people started to think about the problem in a different way, because if the item is unpaid, that's the problem. And now we need to get the item paid. What can we do to get the item paid? And it really took a lot of the acrimony out of that process. And there was a lot less finger pointing. And the same is true on the fraud alert side. We renamed the fraud alert process. We called it the item not received, or the significantly not as described process. And that, again, it talks about the problem that needs to be addressed. We created something called the dispute console, where every user had access to a console that would track all of their problems to resolution. People did not like the word dispute. There was huge pushback from the marketplace on the word dispute. So we did an internal exercise with the marketing team, and we came up with the name Resolution Center, which emphasizes the positive side. It's still the same thing, but we're trying to get you a resolution to your issue. And people liked Resolution Center. And now I find it very gratifying that there are many resolution centers across the internet. We came up with that term, but there's a resolution center at Airbnb. There's a resolution center at Uber and Lyft. There's a resolution center at Upwork. Because I think all of these collaborative marketplaces, all these sharing economy companies, the marketplace administrator has a few core responsibilities. And one of those is dispute resolution. And that's why having a resolution center reinforces the message to the marketplace participants that if you have a problem, you can come here and you can get it resolved. So I do think we broke the ice on some of these issues, and some of the concepts that we pioneered. We built the first crowdsourced resolution process for e-commerce. We called it the community court at eBay. And if you had a dispute over feedback, over a review that one of your transaction partners had left for you, you could file it with the community court, and we would convene a jury of other eBay users that you've never transacted with, and they would listen to the arguments and render a decision. My partner Chitu, who's my closest work collaborator, we built the community court together and scaled it, did tens of thousands of disputes, and we wrote a bunch of articles about it. And we were at a conference in China where representatives from Alibaba were there, and they saw that presentation, and they said, wow, this is really interesting. Well, eBay eventually shut down the community court. Some of eBay's other sites, like Marktplaats in the Netherlands, they continued to use it, that crowdsourced jury process. But Alibaba has another marketplace in China called Taobao, and they have used that crowdsourced dispute resolution technique. And I think they've explicitly said the first time they heard about it was from our presentation in Hong Kong at one of the ODR forums. And now that's resolving millions and millions of disputes. There are people who go to work every day in China on the bus, and they're on their app deciding disputes that Taobao enforces. So it is exciting to be kind of present at the creation and come up with some ideas and refine them a little bit, but then see other people take the baton and run with them.
Yeah. So definitely you're a groundbreaking individual at that time, but you've seen it, transition over the years. And now today, for example, you and I were at a court conference.
Sure.
In the Fort Worth courthouse. How have you seen the ODR world that focus on e-commerce
right
now transition into the court systems? And how have you seen it just massicize all costs, lots of different kinds of things?
Absolutely. And you asked me before, Mac, a question about relationship-based disputes.
Yes.
I think in the early days of ODR, we were very comfortable with these transactional, online-only disputes because really there wasn't a face-to-face option for resolving them. And I had a policy early on at my first company, Online Resolution, no family disputes. Because, first of all, it seemed very emotional. It did not seem like a good fit with the dynamics of online communication at the time. And Janet Rifkin, who's another pioneer in ODR, Ethan's co-author on the first book in the field, Online Dispute Resolution, she had done a family dispute resolution with parties in different countries that really went sideways. And she expressed great misgivings about her ability to meet her ethical obligations as a mediator when she was working remotely with parties. Because one of them, I think, made an idle threat that they would commit suicide. And Janet said, what do I know? This person's in another country. I don't know anyone there. I can't follow up. If it happened in person, I could have taken more direct action. So my feelings were I just didn't feel like those emotional type disputes, in-person disputes, family disputes, workplace disputes, neighbor disputes, it didn't feel like a good fit with my platform at the time. So when those cases came in through our landing page, I would often say, sorry, we don't handle these disputes. But the parties would push back. And we did have some family disputes. And they said, look, we've already separated. We live in different states. We don't want to get together in person. We're trying to figure out how to split up the assets from the sale of a house or something like that. Why can't we use your platform? And I said, well, I just feel that it's just not a good fit at this time. The way that we run these platforms, we run these disputes are better for kind of more simple transactional disputes between strangers. But so what's happened between now and then? Because now ODR is one of the hottest areas of ODR. And we have WeVorce.com, we have BlissDivorce.com, we have HelloDivorce.com, we have Divorce.com. There's Amicable in the UK. All over the world, people are now using technology to handle the divorce and separation process. So what changed between 2002 and 2025? Well, the culture has changed enormously. And the younger generation in particular, you think about Gen Zs and Gen Alphas, everything is online. And they've gotten to the point where they feel very comfortable having emotional communications through technology. In some respects, there are studies that indicate they may even prefer that for difficult conflicts, they have online ways, online computer-mediated communication between the parties. So I think not only that, the technology has changed, right? Because when we were looking at this in 2002, we didn't have iPhones, we didn't have mobile devices, we didn't have Zoom, we didn't have social networking. So it's very interesting to me how the concept of online dispute resolution and even the core theoretical concept of the fourth party that Ethan and Janet introduced in their book has flexed over time as the technology has changed and as the culture has changed. And especially with the pandemic, I think we only had the option of communicating through technology. And a lot of people experienced it for the first time and understood that it is more convenient. It can be effective. So now, if you look back to December 2019, I would say 90% of mediations were happening face-to-face. And now, if you look in the United States, about 80% of mediations are happening over technology. So it's been a huge change. And I don't think it was all about dispute resolution. It was really the wider culture changed.
Yeah, well, can you connect us back to Zoom? I
Sure.
know that you had some interactions with Zoom in the early days of their creation. And now most mediators in Work for Solve are using Zoom to mediate. So can you just tell us what happened?
Yeah, I mean, we were experimenting with video based mediation even back when I was doing online resolution in 2001, 2002. But the quality was very low. And it took a lot of work, nerdy work, to get your computer and your sound card and your video card to all work together. So it just didn't seem practical at the time. Even though there was, again, much like the broader internet, there was optimism about where it would eventually go and some prognostication about that. As you say, I was running Modria, which was the online dispute resolution company that Chitu and I spun out of eBay and PayPal. And we were in downtown San Jose in an office building, and a new business moved in, kind of not too far from us. And we went over to visit them and say hello. And it was a couple Chinese and Chinese American engineers who had recently left Cisco, and they had been working on a product called WebEx that Cisco had, which was kind of an online collaboration platform. And I asked them, well, what are you doing? And they said, well, we're going to start a video conferencing company. And I was like, well, that's a tough business. I mean, you're up against Cisco and Microsoft and Google, good luck. But they said, well, we have some technical chops. Let's see what we can do. And the name of that company was Zoom. And they said, well, what do you do? Because we were not too far away. And I said, well, we do online dispute resolution. Oh, what's that? So we walked through and talked about negotiation, mediation, arbitration. We talked about what we'd done at eBay and PayPal. And they said, well, would you ever use video for resolving disputes? Well, maybe one day. It's not very common right now, very rare, but maybe one day. So they said, well, what features, would be helpful in a video conferencing platform? And I said, well, one of the things we do a lot in dispute resolution is we caucus. So we have a joint session with all the parties, and then we say, okay, we're going to take a break, and I'm just going to meet privately with party A, and then I'm going to meet privately with party B. And there was no video conference platform at that time that enabled that sort of caucus functionality. So they came into my conference room, and I drew it out on our whiteboard. They said, oh, very interesting. So maybe 2 or 3 weeks later, they came back and said, hey, guess what? We built your breakout rooms. I said, oh, what's that? And they showed it to me in the platform, the ability to have a large meeting with a bunch of people, and you take a subset of people and you push them into a smaller room. And they hadn't built it exactly the way that I had described it. I wanted to be able to knock on individual doors, kind of like a mediator could knock on a door and say, hey, I'm coming in there in 2 minutes. They made it so you could make an announcement to all the rooms, which is a little bit less flexible. And they called it breakout rooms, not caucus rooms, because I think that they didn't think people really knew what caucuses were. If at the time they had said, would you like some shares in our company for giving us this idea? I would say, no, it's fine. Don't worry about it. Just buy me a sandwich, But that may end up being my biggest contribution to technology. All the work I've done building ODR platforms may be dwarfed by that one suggestion. And I think if you went to Zoomtopia, their conference, they still do in San Jose with their tens of thousands of people, and they said, Colin Rule, breakout rooms. They'd say, who? But I still have all the documentation. I have the photos I took of the whiteboard, and I made all my fellow employees at Modria promise to remember that I was the one who planted that seed with Zoom. But now, of course, Zoom is incredibly high quality. The audio is high quality, the video is high quality. All of us have pretty much set up in our house a camera and a microphone and a headset because Zoom is the new phone, and video conferencing has become very, very mainstreamed. And a lot of the mediators that express great reservation about doing online video-based mediation processes because you couldn't see the tapping foot, you couldn't smell the pheromones in the room. Well, the pandemic forced them into a situation where they had to try it out. And the benefits of convenience and cost, actually, mediation has changed technology, but technology has also changed mediation. So now you don't make party B wait while you're in caucus with party A. You just say, okay, well, let's have a video call, go make yourself a sandwich, let's reconnect all together at 1 p.m. So, and the ability for a party to be in their house with their cat on their lap, not feeling vulnerable, not feeling, awkward in some law firm conference room, that they had to go down and park in some expensive garage. So it does seem to me that this change is a one-way gate. And now that and the technology is just going to get better, as I say, as bandwidth improves and processors become more powerful, audio and video quality is going to get sharper and better and more immersive. So, it was interesting to be part of the early experiments and to see where it's come and to prognosticate about where it's going.
So would you say that Zoom, or the Zoom boom, as I like to refer to it sometimes, is what has made it ODR mainstream?
Yeah, it's interesting. I have a friend who's worked with me. He's my CMO at ODR.com, and he was my CMO at Modria as well. And he said, wow, Colin, you're like the dog that caught the car. We were out there talking about this for a long time before people were really doing it at scale. And then some of the courts I work with, they describe COVID as a 30-year push into the future, a shove into the future. They didn't necessarily want to do it, but they had to do it. And once they figured out how to do it, well, then they don't want to get rid of it. So now everyone's using it, and courts have video conferencing is commonplace in the judicial system. But I think that really did legitimize a lot of the things that we had talked about and move them from the edges as an exception to become the new default. So I used to say, look, if you bring technology into your mediation process in any way, that is ODR, even if it's just a filing form or emailing your parties or using a doodle to figure out a time to get on a conference call. And now I think it's pretty hard to find any mediation happening in the United States that doesn't have some aspect of technology. Maybe it's 0.01%. There are people who really don't use email. They don't use online credit card payment processing. But the vast, vast majority of mediators use technology in one way or the other. And now we're focused on how do we optimize that.
So tell us a little bit about the international scope of all of this. Before we start wrapping up and we talk about the future and the promise of it, can you just bring us out a little bit. We talk about India. We talk about China a little bit.
Absolutely.
Can you tell us what's going on globally?
Well,
I guess going back in time as well.
yeah, if you think about the creation of the mediation movement in the United States, it was a hyper-local thing. It was community mediation centers that were opening up in small towns. It really happened in Massachusetts first. They created community justice centers, and they were saying, look, don't go to court. You can come to this community justice center. You can work out your neighbor problem. You can work out, whatever issues. So you don't have to go through the full judicial process. The thing that's interesting about ODR is it was global first, because e-commerce was really the spur that created the ODR field. And the reason why eBay and Amazon and all these companies needed ODR was because the existing redress processes couldn't handle their scale. They couldn't figure out how to resolve these disputes that reached into every corner of the world. Anyone could take out their phone and go swipe, swipe, swipe and buy from another person in a different culture and a different legal jurisdiction. So we were building global systems first, and then we were bringing them down into individual countries. And eBay really didn't pay much attention to the local jurisdictions that it sold into, what the regulations were, because we were operating in 50 countries in 13 different languages. So the law in Korea didn't really factor into it, right? It was almost like we had eBay law. And when someone signed up on eBay, you were agreeing to have your transactions governed by eBay law. The other early ODR system that was very international in its scope was the UDRP, the Uniform Domain Name Dispute Resolution Protocol, that was implemented by ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. They run all the domain names. So because anyone around the world could buy any domain name, you couldn't have the resolution of any disputes that arose regarding domain names governed by any one legal jurisdiction. So that was also a very forward-looking example of a global redress process that crossed jurisdictions, and it's worked very, very well. It continues to work to this very day, and there have been different providers that have opted into the UDRP. So what we got some interest initially from the commercial side, and there were international organizations that said, well, hey, this is a big problem. Every country wants its sellers to be able to sell globally. But how can you provide protection to consumers that are buying from sellers in other countries? And how can sellers be protected against frivolous claims from buyers all over the world? So it started very quickly a dialogue between governments. The European Union was a little bit ahead of the curve, and they issued some policy papers and some regulatory kind of ethics frameworks for cross-border ODR, because obviously if you're in Luxembourg, 80% of your transactions are cross-border, whereas if you're here in Texas, probably at that time, 90% of your transactions would be domestic U.S. So some parts of the world really led on putting frameworks in place for that. But eventually it went to the United Nations. And we realized we needed to have a global conversation about how to design a cross-border redress process. And we took a proposal to UNCITRAL, which is the UN agency responsible for harmonizing global laws, and said, look, we should put together a working group to envision what this cross-border redress process would look like. And they eventually accepted that proposal, and we became Working Group 2 under UNCITRAL. And we met for about 6 years. We'd have one meeting in Vienna and then another meeting in New York each year. And there were representatives from most of the major economies in the world trying to figure out what would this look like. Should it be a treaty? Should it be a soft law that could be adopted within each opt-in country? We had the precedent of the New York Convention, which was about the enforceability of arbitral awards. So that inspired the work of Working Group 2. But, there were some major disagreements. And really, I think disagreements between the United States, which really wanted the private sector to lead, and the European Union that really wanted the public sector to lead, led to, we never really got a firm outcome, like a treaty or a soft law. But we did come up with a very clear set of recommendations as to how cross-border ODR could work. And that was eventually adopted as a non-binding resolution by the General Assembly. But we've seen international organizations. The International Standards Organization just did a long project on cross-border e-commerce quality, and ODR was a big part of that. We created the International Council for Online Dispute Resolution, which was a spin-out. So I mentioned CITDR, the Center for Information Technology and Dispute Resolution. That eventually evolved into NCTDR, the National Center for Technology and Dispute Resolution. And we spun out a nonprofit called ICODR, the International Council for Online Dispute Resolution, which promotes best practice standards for ODR. So, and now APEC, which is the treaty organization for all the countries that ring the Pacific, has also been very forward thinking about ODR, and they've created a framework for resolving cross-border B2B e-commerce disputes. So yeah, I think the embrace of ODR happened first at the international level. And then we started to see individual geographies, countries say, wow, this is something that we need as well. So certain countries like the Netherlands and Canada, they were way out front in integrating online dispute resolution into their judicial systems. I think the United States was actually a little behind the curve. We had a lot of private innovation in the ODR space, but not a lot of acceptance from the public sector, at least initially. Yeah.
Before we leave the international space, and thank you so much for mentioning iCode, I wanted to make sure that we get that out.
Sure.
Before we leave the international discussion, what about the developing world? How have they, over the number of years, evolved into adopting ODR?
Absolutely. Well, it's been very interesting. We have ODRAfrica.com, which is run by my friend Morenike out of Lagos. We have ODR Latino America, or ODR Latam, run by Alberto Elisavetsky out of Buenos Aires. I think I've said to you, I really believe that the most exciting geography in the world right now for ODR is India. And the Modi government has been very aggressive in digitizing a lot of the operations of civil society in India, and they've long had challenges in the court system. The average time from filing to resolution in a civil case in India is more than 10 years. So there are a lot of people, they say justice delayed is justice denied. And I think a lot of young people in India realize that that system is not working. Many, many people are ground up in the inefficiencies and the corruption within the court system. So India has a national research arm called Niti Aayog that's sponsored by the government. And they did a giant report on how ODR could benefit India, the ODR policy plan for India. And there have been a bunch of nonprofits that have cropped up to modernize the justice system, including a great organization called Agami, which received a lot of investment from the Omidyar Foundation, ironically. Pierre Omidyar was the founder of eBay. So all these things kind of come together. But young people in India are embracing technology. The government is embracing technology, building public systems for tracking payments and getting fast and fair resolutions. So I really believe in a matter of years, the number of ODR processes in India may dwarf the rest of the world, because you're talking about 1.4 billion people. It's a rapidly growing country. And the innovation that I'm seeing, I think there's something like 20 new ODR providers that have launched in India over the past 5 to 10 years. And companies like Presolve and Sama, they're growing like crazy. And many, many businesses, many, many public institutions in India are embracing their services in a way that we don't really see in the US. China as well has done an amazing thing with their internet courts. And they've built all online courts where people can file cases online. The judges operate via video. And I was lucky enough to be one of the first Western observers of the internet court in Hangzhou, which is kind of the Silicon Valley of China. And I was blown away by the sophistication of what they built and the embrace of civil society in China of these tools, because they acknowledge that they need to provide fast and fair solutions, and the world is digitizing. So we have to build a justice system that works the way the internet works, and that's kind of what ODR is. So I actually think the geographies where ODR has gotten the fastest traction are places where the courts have the most struggles. So I think about Brazil, which has a huge backlog of consumer cases that the courts just can't get to. I think about Italy, which also had significant delays in its civil caseloads. And then I think about India, which has huge delays. If you look at countries that have very efficient and trusted judiciaries like Japan and Germany, they have, and in Israel as well, they've been much slower to adopt ODR because they don't need it as much, because the existing process is efficient and is trusted. But slowly but surely, I think the encroach of technology into the justice system is inexorable. And I think eventually, when Germany and Japan and Israel build an ODR system within their courts, it's going to be amazing because they build great technology. But they've been able to hold out longer as opposed to some areas of the developing world. And I personally hold out great excitement. I was served in Eritrea in the Peace Corps for 2 years, to think about my students and people who are in a country where the justice system was not trusted. If they can get a mobile device and get access to the internet, they can get access to a meaningful dispute resolution process that might be able to deliver some justice to them. So my friend Richard Susskind, who's a a big thinker on AI and the law, and he's the chief IT advisor to the Lord Chief Justice in the UK. He's written in many of his books on these topics about technology and justice that 50% of people around the world don't have meaningful access to a justice system, to a fast and fair resolution system. And, if you think that access to justice is synonymous with access to lawyers, there's really no way to move that needle beyond the 50%. Maybe you could bump it to 52, 53%, but that would cost an enormous amount of money. But technology like ODR, if instead, the courts are not a place, they're a service, and a service can be delivered over mobile devices. And we're seeing mobile devices drop in price, and even in the developing world, pretty much everybody's got a cell phone. So if you can get resolution, if you can get redress through that device, I think we have a pathway to expanding access to justice and getting access to the unjustest and bringing them into a justice system. I think we have opportunities that would have been unimaginable 20 years ago.
Yes, well, I think that starts hitting at the question, can ODR change the world? Which is the working title for this documentary.
Great.
Can ODR change the world? The story and promise of tech-based dispute resolution.
So, I love it.
In the last, 5 to 10 minutes we have left, what would be your answer? That's how I close all the questions to all the, folks I'm interviewing. What will be your answer to the question, can ODR change the world?
Well, absolutely. ODR can change the world. And this is, I've devoted my life to ODR, and I'm definitely a glass half full kind of person. I think the introduction of the internet has had many unintended negative consequences, for sure. There are many people who are not dispute resolvers. They are dispute exacerbators, and they will use the power of technology to exacerbate disputes. But there are those of us who are devoted to innovating and advancing technology in a way that builds understanding, builds connection, expands justice, and is grounded in the values of the dispute resolution field: fairness, transparency, empathy. So, I don't know what it's going to look like in its final form, but I do know that wherever people are, there is conflict, there are disagreements, our self-interests can clash. And every time a new tool is invented, we put that into the toolbox. And right now, the shiny new tool is artificial intelligence, and it's very, very exciting to think about what doors that's going to open for us. But I remember when we put video into the toolbox. I remember when we put mobile devices into the toolbox. And our goals in the online dispute resolution field did not change. We want to provide fast and fair resolutions to everybody. We believe that's a human right to get access to justice. And utilizing these tools in a creative way to expand access to justice, that's what motivates us. So when we get a new tool, we immediately ask ourselves, okay, how can we use this? How can we plug this into the systems that we build? How can we better achieve the objectives that we've long held with this new tool? And there's going to be new things for sure. I'm almost certain that there's somebody at Google that's inventing some antenna that you can screw into your temple, and you'll be able to beam your thoughts to other people. And guess what? That may be creepy when they first launch it, but eventually everybody's going to have it, and we're going to ask ourselves in ODR, well, how can we use this to help resolve disputes? So. I was saying the other day, I have a photograph of a cuneiform tablet from ancient Mesopotamia, where a buyer and a seller are arguing over the quality of a copper ingot. So that was thousands of years before the birth of Christ, and it sounds almost exactly like an eBay dispute now. So conflict is part of the human condition, and we need to constantly build systems to fairly resolve conflicts and deliver justice, because that's a key component of peacemaking. And, as the tools get more powerful, those of us who are devoted to online dispute resolution will figure out how to use them. And I do believe the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. And one of the ways that we achieve that justice is by innovating, utilizing all these tools, and being taking the macro vision in thinking about how we can achieve world peace through these types of techniques.
Thank you. And personally, what would you want your legacy to be? Because you, like you said, have spent your life working in this space. Not this, but people don't get a chance to get on camera and basically speak into the future.
Sure.
What would you say?
Well, I stand on the shoulders of giants. I mean, I was inspired when I was just a baby mediator by the founders of the Program on Negotiation, and Roger Fisher, Debbie Kolb, Howard Rafa. These were people, and Frank Sander in particular, and many of those people, many of the people that looked up to them as heroes were my mentors. They opened doors for me. They created a field for me. I didn't create the dispute resolution field. It was a generation before me that created that field. But now I feel some of my mentors are, hanging up their spurs, so to say, and I have my hand on the tiller, and I get a certain period of time here where I can steer the field and make as many contributions as I can to try and again achieve our shared objectives. But there's going to be a time when I get old. I used to think there's going to be a billionaire in ODR, and I know it's not going to be me. But they're probably in third grade in Bangalore right now. But what I can do during the time that I'm steering the boat is make as much progress as I can, make the best choices that I can, not knowing where the technology is going or where the world is going, and then happily hand it off to some bright, young, eager person like I was once as well, and then they can stand on my shoulders. So it's definitely a chain. It spans more than any one person's life. But I have loved being involved with the creation of a field. I've loved my colleagues. I love working with mediators. I love being a peacemaker. It motivates me every day. And, I hope that future generations of people who pick up the tools that we put together will share that same passion and will be able to achieve our objectives in ways that we were never able to do within the scope of our lives.
Well said. So thank you so much for this sit down. And I've learned a lot.
Oh, thanks a lot.
All right.
I appreciate it.
Recording.
Okay, great.